Good evening and welcome to the program. Kieran in for David tonight on the eve of an emergency summit convened by Energy Minister Josh Frydenberg with his state counterparts to be held in Melbourne tomorrow. This, of course, in the wake of the storms in South Australia and the blackout in that state. The question tonight is, and we're going to be exploring this in depth, what are the implications for the debate around energy security in this country and for renewable energy more broadly? Coming up, the Minerals Council for their view. Brendan Pearson, the Chief Executive of the Minerals Council, will be joining me. We're going to talk to the experts from the Climate Council as well. Also, Philip Curry and Mark Kenny from the Fin Review and the Sydney Morning Herald. Those two gentlemen joining me for the journalist perspective on this as well. First, though, to the Deputy Director at the ANU's Crawford School of Public Policy, Professor Frank Jotzo. Professor Jotzo, thanks so much for joining me here this evening. I want to ask you about this key question of energy security versus clean energy. Can that be met? Because at the moment, as the Minister's pointed out repeatedly in recent days, that renewable energy, by and large, still is intermittent energy.
Yes, okay, it's not a versus at all, actually. What you want is energy security, no matter how you produce the energy. And clean energy very clearly is the way of the future. It's what the technology provides and what will, in fact, very likely be cheapest in decades to come. But clearly, you know, the energy security aspect needs to be covered, and the recent events in South Australia go to show that the engineering aspects of that need to be developed and need to be in check. And so I think the renewed emphasis on energy security is completely understandable and justified. It's just important not to lose the sight on the longer-term objective.
Can you provide any clarity for our viewers tonight as to whether or not renewable energy played any part in the outage of that system?
No, look, I mean, it was a major weather event. 3 major power lines went down. That was the cause of the trouble. And then all sorts of events happened from there. 3 wind parks were connected off the grid.
It could have happened with coal-fired power is the point.
Pretty much, yeah. So I think the investigation will go on just what happened in those crucial 2 minutes when things started being disconnected and the interconnector overloaded, et cetera, right. And whether, in fact, the renewable energy systems there behave differently in that very extreme situation.
One of the points that's been made by Barnaby Joyce and others is that one of the problems isn't just the fact that it's intermittent energy, but that it takes longer to crank back up, that gas and coal-fired power stations are much more quickly reinstated over wind or solar.
Yeah, look, any type of power station has different characteristics in terms of how quickly it can be ramped up or down. Coal-fired power stations, for example, on the whole, cannot be ramped up or down very quickly at all. Gas-fired power stations can. And so, you know, each of these technologies has their own pros and cons in terms of their reactivity to specific events. And when we look ahead to a very largely renewable energy system, then you invariably have that paired with storage, energy storage, be it in water reservoirs for hydro turbines to produce energy very, very quickly, be it in batteries, right? And that's the system of the future you're looking for. In South Australia, we have the interesting...
So you mentioned batteries. Yeah. I'll get you to elaborate on South Australia as well, because it has been aggressive in terms of pursuing renewable energy. But on battery technology, where is that at?
Oh, it's developing very, very rapidly, and we're seeing deployment of battery trucks even to hotspots in the middle of summer at very high electricity demand, where those batteries provide the electricity needed. But really, we're just at the cusp where we will see costs of battery storage fall really dramatically, and that's when you'll see it more broadly.
And what about South Australia? You're going to touch on that, the fact that more than 40% is in renewables?
Yeah, so it's an unusual situation in that you have very high renewables share there in South Australia, but without many of the systems around it that you'll ultimately see in a close to 100% renewable energy grid. For example, stronger interconnectors between the states, right? So what happened after the power lines went down is that the interconnector to Victoria overloaded, and that was pretty much the end of the story. In a largely renewable situation where you have renewable generation playing a much larger role across the country, you'll also want to see greater interconnectivity between the states. So
is there a risk, though, if you... one of the arguments that I've seen in relation to the interconnectors, there are the Victoria to South Australia interconnectors, but is there a risk that they become redundant if, for example, you spend upwards of, I think it's $3 billion to build one between New South Wales and South Australia to provide greater insurance for their supply, but then by the time you finished it, it's redundant?
Yeah, so it's unlikely to be redundant because what you will get is greater variability in terms of where the energy is being generated, right? So you might have a situation where during the day, on a sunny day, you've got a lot of solar electricity generation in New South Wales that flows over into South Australia. On a windy night, it goes the other way, right? And so the system that we'll have in future will look very different. Different types of generation, different grids, and not to forget microgrids. And in fact, the localized generation of electricity could play a much larger role in future as well.
Well, we know what the cheapest and most stable baseload has been for many years in this country is coal. Can I ask why is there no focus really on the clean coal technologies, or little focus like carbon capture and storage, or as we've seen largely taken up in Asia, new coal-fired power stations with 50% of the CO2 emissions that we see in legacy power stations?
Yeah, so what we have in Australia is a system that is dominated by older coal-fired power stations, which on the whole have very low efficiencies because the fuel costs in Australia are very low, so it's very understandable why they were built that way. But many of them are past their design lives, and so the question is, what do you replace them with? Now, in Australia, we're blessed with an ample and very cheap supply of renewable energy, and that's very likely where the journey is going to go with the addition of some gas-fired power as well. Now, in other countries, the situation is different, and it's not so easy to fulfill the majority of electricity demand from renewables. And China, for example, our colleagues in the Deep Decarbonisation Project, where we map out nationally what a clean energy system could look like in all of these different countries, our Chinese colleagues place great emphasis on what you just mentioned, carbon capture and sequestration for the coal-fired power.
So there is some investment going in that space. The other one...
Not enough.
Okay, so you think there's still a worthwhile area to be pursuing?
Well, look, I mean, it's seen as an important part of the global energy system in a low-carbon world, but it's still very expensive, and we haven't seen costs come down nearly as much as we have in renewables.
And a historic day today in many respects, because the Paris Agreement has basically been locked in as of today, because the requisite number of nations that needed to sign it to bring it into effect have now ratified it.
That's right.
And that will come into effect as of November of this year. In terms of Australia's trajectory to get to those targets, is it your view that we need to ramp up our renewable energy target, for example, to be more comparable to the state targets? Is that your sense of things?
Well, the national emissions target of 26 to 28% reduction at 2030 will require additional policy effort. That's really clear. That's clear from the kind of analysis that the government themselves have put out. There's really no doubt about that. The question is, in what mix will that come, right? So how much of that will come from forestry, how much will come from energy? The important thing is to extrapolate out to potentially, to much deeper targets as they will be needed to keep within that 2-degree warming envelope. And that gives you an almost carbon-free electricity sector by the middle of the century. That's really one of the easiest ways of achieving deep reductions in Australia. And so we need to get on that track. What that means for the electricity mix at 2030, well, 50% renewables is possible nationally, according to the analysis that we have done, that many others have done. Will it be achieved by a federal renewable energy target? Will it be achieved by other policy instruments? Will it, in fact, cost a lot compared to the alternatives, investing in new fossil fuel plants? That's not altogether clear.
Professor Frank Jotzo from the Crawford School of Public Policy. As always, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for that. And I'm joined now